Big Bang to base. Under attack by commie Nazis.
So there's this meme, and this meme was apparently believed by Hitler and Himmler. And you see it floating around on occasion by what you call conservative people, which was that the Nazis had better success recruiting communists to their party than in recruiting liberals. Liberals in the classical sense, not in the American sense of the word. So where do we begin with this? Well, I started by just looking at elections in Nazi Germany, just looking over the Wikipedia page, and the electoral map just popped out at me. Here's where the liberals are, here's where the communists are, and you see the Nazis just taking over the communist area. The red turns into brown. It's a simplified map that only shows the winning party. So the reality under the hood is likely more complicated than this, but the hypothesis that one would form from seeing this kind of simple portrayal, seeing these images, is fairly self-explanatory, and it seems to confirm Hitler and Himmler's hunches. So I decided to look at more detailed election data by district, and so this is from the Statistical Yearbook of the German Empire, and there's a page that has all sorts of years looking at it. I don't know what a Wahlkreis is, so I'm just going to call these districts. Can't read German, but I can tell, like, this is the SPD, this is the KPD, this is the NSDAP. This is the total because all the party columns add up to this. I don't know what these things are, so I just ignored them. And I put them into an Excel-like program, and I compared the results from the May 1928 election to the March 1933 election. As an aside, this is pretty basic data that should be linked on the Wikipedia page, but it isn't. Instead, they do something pretty horrible. They link a book. And this shouldn't be acceptable. They're basically saying, this is true. Want to check? Pay money. Now, LibGen and SciHub have mitigated this problem somewhat, this kind of asshole sourcing. But LibGen has a kind of a higher unavailability rate for their books than SciHub does, where SciHub almost always works. So LibGen and SciHub work to sort of mitigate the problems of asshole sourcing, but LibGen not as well. And we need to get into the habit of just linking SciHub links and LibGen links. Paywalls are unacceptable, and you don't need book sales to make money today. Most of that money just goes to a publisher anyway, not the actual author. And getting published, quote unquote, for either a book or an article is just a racket anyway. So just this needs to be denormalized. We need to start shaming people for engaging in this kind of asshole sourcing. There's no reason to do this anymore. But let's get back on track. I looked at the election results, and my first hunch was how did party support in 1928 predict party support in 1933? And I found these relations. SDP support, which is the Social Democrat Party, but don't let that name fool you into thinking they're kind of a milquetoast like party. They're actually, well, you can read into the SDP and what they believed in at the time and how they have changed since then. But basically, they were reformist communists, advancing communism through the democratic system. So SDP support in 1928 positively correlated with Nazi support in 1933 at 0.22. Pretty decent relationship. 0 would be no relationship. 0 would mean that SDP people are no more or less likely to go over to the Nazi side than anyone else. This positive relationship is evidence that SDP supporters were a bit more likely to join the Nazi party than everyone else in Germany, than all the other parties. The relation between KPD support, which is the more general strike insurrectionary communists, between their support in 1928 and Nazi support in 1933, that relation was 0.146. Some backstory for those who don't know, both the SPD and KPD were nominally communist parties. The philosophy of the SPD was to bring communism to Germany through gradual reform, while the KPD believed in the general strike and or mass insurrection. In fact, in 1918, when the SPD was the plurality party in Germany and was the head of the coalition ruling government, they hired the Free Corps to put down the communist uprisings in Bavaria, meaning the SPD, who are already a somewhat heretical branch of communism, then, once in power, actively crushed a communist insurrection. This, not surprisingly, led to some bad blood between the SPD and the KPD. And we can imagine this would be worse than if a conservative party did something like that, because what else would you expect from, a conservative party? But when someone who is ostensibly a fellow communist, that seems to be particularly galling. Now, in my opinion, just from a purely strategic perspective, the KPD was obviously correct. Look at where nominally communist parties took power around the world, ever. Russia, China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba. None of this ever happened through democratic reform. That never happens, right? It always happens through insurrection. Now, once the nominally communist state comes into existence, then all their ideas sort of fall apart. But getting to that first stage, getting to that first step, the KPD is obviously, on firmer ground. So, if your goal is communism, then the general strike mass insurrection is the only proven way for it to get at least to that first step, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or whatever the hell they call it. Also, this insurrectionary democratic split, it also existed with the Republicans in Spain. But let's get back on track. SPD support in 1928 versus KPD support in 1933, almost no relation. During these years, the SPD was collapsing, but it doesn't look like much of their support was going to the KPD, if any at all. It looks like their support from the SPD was going to the Nazi Party. This then explains the two previous relation. What was happening was SPD support was going to the Nazis, but KPD support was more or less standing firm. That's what it looks like here. Then an area with high SPD support would predict a rise of the Nazis. But if an area had high KPD support, that basically functioned as kind of a rock that the Nazis couldn't get at. I also looked at other party support, which I classed as liberal and particularists, sort of lumped them together. And particularists would be like the Schleswig-Holstein Party, the Bavarian Party, the Hanoverian Party. Liberal parties would be like the Center Party or the German People's Party, but mainly liberal parties. And this had basically no relation to Nazi growth. Yes, because the Nazis were rising, you will get some crossover from these liberal and particularists to the Nazi Party. The point is that liberals and particularists were not relatively any more likely to cross over to the Nazi Party than Germany as a whole. But regarding the KPD, it's possible that there was a larger crossover from the KPD to the Nazi Party than the data suggests, but there's no way to tell because they didn't have, to my knowledge, the kind of detailed data on party flipping that you get today. I say this is possible because during the years the Nazis were rising to power, the KPD was also growing in popularity. This makes any flow between the KPD and Nazi Party more or less invisible, or at least very difficult to infer. With the SPD, it's easier because they collapsed, and then we can see who gained votes where the SPD was popular before, and then when the SPD suddenly collapsed, who became popular immediately following the collapse of the SPD. With the KPD, they didn't collapse anywhere. So even if there was substantial movement from the KPD to the Nazi Party, it wouldn't be detectable given the limited data that I know of. So when Himmler and Hitler say they could more easily get a communist than a liberal to latch on to the Nazi Party, well, what exactly do they mean by communist? Because if you think the only true Scotsman is a KPD member, then you'd be on good statistical ground to say that the Nazis didn't poach on net from the KPD, and so they didn't poach any true communists, right? If you think the SPD were in fact communists, then what Himmler and Hitler are saying, it seems to have some truth to it. Of course, there's always going to be some KPD voters who flip to Nazi voters who flip to the KPD, but in the aggregate, from this data at least, you can't say anything like that was happening because both parties were growing. At least you can't say that conclusively, that anything like that was happening. Now, I also looked at change in party support correlating with change in some other party support. Did growth in the Nazi Party correlate with decline in the SPD? Things like that. And it mostly confirms the other charts. Change in SPD support correlated with change in NSDAP support negatively. Right? So we can see that as the SPD lost more votes, the Nazis gained more votes. Change in SPD support has almost no relation with change in KPD support, which is evidence that that the SPD voters, once they leave the SPD, they don't go to the KPD. They seem to be going to the Nazi Party. But here's something that I found interesting to me. Growth in the KPD and growth in the Nazi Party went together. So in areas where the Nazi Party grew, the KPD grew. Oh, and you could say that makes sense because the SPD is collapsing and the SPD voters are then, going off either to the Nazi Party or the KPD. But wait a minute, you can't say that because everything up to this point strongly suggests that SPD voters were not going to the KPD. Now I'm getting ahead here a bit, but this ties into something else I'm working on, which is that the notion of left and right are kind of stupid, and what actually exists is cultic and non-cultic thinking along a spectrum. Clearly, there has always been a quasi-binary political spectrum. This seems to have always been around, but to focus on policy or ideological content is very stupid and fails to explain a lot of phenomenon, and it leads to a lot of inconsistencies, right? Like, for example, I think everyone should mix together, but I think Tibetans should remain separate, and I'm against segregation, but I love Native American reservations, right? All sorts of little inconsistencies that don't make a lot of sense if you think there's something consistent in left and right in terms of the ideological content. If you look at it as just sort of cults that happen, they're hypocritical. There's no rhyme or reason to any of it. People just fall for cults and they fall into cultic reasoning. Some people do it more, some people do it don't, and that's really all that you're seeing. Don't try to make some sort of consistency thing about it. These are all just sort of emergent phenomenon. Nobody cares about inconsistencies, at least on a grand scale. You could try maybe persuade an individual and point out inconsistencies in the group they're with, but on the grand scale, things are emergent. Inconsistencies are kind of either not known, not brought to the forefront of mind, not pointed out, right? Stuff. And so, this sort of cultic, non-cultic reasoning explains a lot of things that otherwise seem very bizarre if you're looking at it from like a purely ideological content standpoint. And frankly, if you're looking at the difference between quote-unquote left and quote-unquote right from a purely ideological content standpoint, that may be a sign that you've gotten sucked into a cause, that you're not thinking straight because you're thinking in like this, in kind of a box, and kind of like a belief set that's sort of been handed to you. And so the very fact that you approach political things from the point of view of the ideological content is a sign that your mind's kind of been plinked. And so this unified rise of the KPD with the Nazis, according to what I'm working on, it seems to be evidence of a general rise in cultic thinking in Germany in this time, right? And the collapse of the I just want to grill parties like the Center Party, the German People's Party, the Particularist Party like the Bavarian Party. Right? The I just want to grill parties were collapsing. No one was going to let you grill in Germany at this time. Not yet Nazi Germany, but on the road to be. But to evidence that all the stuff that I was saying about the cultic thing, that's a whole project unto itself. So for that stuff, take it or leave it. I'm not going to provide the necessary evidence for that here, but it is interesting that the Nazis and the KPD over this period grew together. In terms of change in liberal particular support, that correlated strongly with both change in KPD and Nazis. However, since the Nazis were growing so much faster than the KPD in terms of total number, yes, liberals will certainly flip to Nazi much more than they would flip to communist. This may also be like a bandwagon effect. You may be looking at a bandwagon effect here. However, relatively speaking, liberals were not particularly more Nazi than they were likely to flip communist compared to Germany as a whole. Meaning the liberal and particularists went to either the Nazi Party or the Communist Party in roughly the same ratio as the German population as a whole. So the liberals were sort of indifferent between the two. So all that taken into consideration, it looks like good evidence that the NSDAP and KPD grew together. The NSDAP grew at the expense of the liberal parties and at the expense of the SDP, while the KPD grew at the expense of only the liberal parties and to a far lesser extent than the Nazi Party. Was there some event that could give some better insight into answering the question of potential Nazi-KPD crossover? Was there a pipeline between the Nazis and the KPD? Because some people will say, well, the SPD, they weren't really communists. They were kind of soft. They called themselves Social Democrat. What does that sound like today? And stuff like that. Okay, well, you can't really do that with the KPD. The KPD really... The no true Scotsman argument really can't apply to the KPD. Did people go back and forth between the KPD and the Nazi Party? Certainly to a lesser extent, given these correlations, but was there any at all? Well, the elections of 1932 may give a clue. In July 1932, the Nazis got 37.27% of the vote. The SPD got 21.58% of the vote, and the KPD got 14.32% of the vote. In November 1932, the Nazis only got 33.09% of the vote. The SPD got 20.43% of the vote, and the KPD got 16.86% of the vote. Their best showing until the Soviet Union took over East Germany, in which case some communist party got like 100% of the vote. But this was their best showing before the war for the KPD. So, I mean, looking at these numbers, what a time to be alive when Nazis and communists get over 70% of the vote in your country. Good things are bound to be around the corner when that happens. So, KPD grew, the Nazis declined in that election. So, I wanted to do a district analysis to try to sort of divine where the votes traveled. Well, unfortunately, this collection of statistical yearbooks of the German Empire doesn't include the November 1932 election. They have the July 1932 election, but not the November 1932 election. Okay, well, I guess we'll just have to look at the overall breakdowns then. From July 1932 to November 1932, the Nazis lost 4.18 points. The SPD lost 1.15 points. The DVNP, which is, and that's another labeled nationalist party that Hitler actually used to be a member of, they gained 2.43 points. The KPD gained 2.54 points. Okay, so the question, where did the KPD get their point shift here? And there's really only two options. Either there were Nazis who flipped to communists, or SPD who joined the KPD. All right, well, let's say all 1.15 of the SPD's losses went to the KPD. That's, I think, quite generous given what we've seen before, but let's just for the thought experiment, let's just give those points to the KPD. That still leaves the KPD with 1.39 points that will have to be explained. Even if we grant the generous assumption that all the SPD's losses went to the KPD still gained 1.39 points somewhere. Well, what party, other than the SPD, lost support between the July and November 1932 elections? Where are these new KPD votes coming from? Now look, it's possible that some really roundabout thing was happening that say, oh, it was the Liberals. The Liberals lost 1.39 points to the KPD, but then they got 1.75 points from the Nazis, and so you get a big coincidental flood of Nazis to Liberal and then Liberal to KPD. All this is possible, and I don't have the data to absolutely positively rule that out. But what's the most parsimonious explanation here? It's that Nazis were flipping to the KPD. Now let's compare the November 1932 to March 1933 election. Nazis gained 10.82 points. SPD lost 2.18 points. KPD lost 4.54 points. The DVNP lost 0.37 points, and the Liberal and Particularist parties lost 3.73 points. Where did the Nazis get those votes? Again, it's possible that some roundabout relationship was going on, and no doubt there, you could find a guy who went from KPD to Liberal, but on the whole, the simplest explanation, what does it look like is happening? So, in these elections, we have clear evidence of crossover from Nazi to KPD, and then KPD to Nazi. Possible is complex web of crossover relations that very few or even none at all KPD voters directly crossed over to the Nazis. But again, the most parsimonious explanation is voters are going back and forth between KPD and Nazi. It has the least moving parts, the least unfounded assumptions. And going back to the July and November 1932 elections, I doubt all those SPD voters were flipping to KPD. That's, I think, kind of a silly and overly generous assumption, which would mean that it's going to be more than 1.39 points of Nazi flip to KPD. It's probably closer. I think it'd be closer to 2, but that's just me. So that's this. The idea of the commie Nazi is not some far-fetched thing. It wasn't just a meme. There's good evidence that it was real. Today, this may seem crazy to you given how much conditioning you've been given about Nazis, and how big a deal wings are today, like left wing and right wing. Like, that's a really important thing today. What wing are you? And since Nazis are right wing and communist is left wing, but people weren't as winged as people as you likely are today. They didn't have this conditioning that, for example, clannishness and collectivist economics were at odds with each other, right? And when you say that out loud, clannishness and collectivist economics are at odds with each other, that just sounds kind of bizarre to sort of say. So they were more open to all manner of ideas. Now, maybe you could say what happened in World War II, that's a bad thing. And the mental straitjackets and the winged thinking and getting people's brains winged exists to protect people from themselves, from creating another Hitler. Or if you were more, empirical about that, just as, if not more, possibly damaging another Stalin. Now, obviously, I disagree with the idea that people should continue to think in wings, but given the priors that most people have, what they think happened in World War II, I can see how one could come to that conclusion. But that's philosophizing based on lots of things that are far beyond the scope of this video. The scope of this video is just to say that yes, the Nazi communist pipeline was real.